Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 288, Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo. We had a bunch of great performances, some crazy finishes, but we also had some very poor performances on the card. And in this video, I am going to look back at UFC 288 and give my opinion on who should be cut from the UFC based on their UFC 288 performance. This is a video idea I kind of came up with during my UFC 288 post-fight. Let me know what you guys think of it. Maybe I'll do it after every pay-per-view card. Maybe eventually I could do it after some of the bigger fight night cards. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Before I get into any of the fighters that I want cut from the UFC, I want you guys to comment down below. Are there any fighters that you saw perform at UFC 288 that you believe should be cut from the UFC roster? Now, also, I know there's going to be some people saying, oh, how dare you wish somebody out of a job? That's not what this is about, okay? This is about who belongs in the UFC and who does not belong in the UFC. And over the past 5 to 6 years, the barrier of entry has been greatly lowered by the UFC. They basically just let anyone in nowadays. But these are the real standouts in poor performances that should definitely be cut from the organization after their performance at UFC 288. Okay, starting off, and I have 3 cuts from UFC 288. Starting off with number 3, we have Joseph Holmes. He lost to Claudio Ribeiro. And in this fight, in the first round, he landed some good leg kicks. But that's about it. He landed some good oblique kicks. And that was it. In the first round, he clinched up. He basically fought in the clinch, really didn't land any strikes in the clinch with Claudio Ribeiro, and basically gassed out in the first round just clinching up. That's it. Didn't throw a whole lot of strikes, and basically gassed out in the clinch. Towards the end of the first round, Claudio Ribeiro took him down, dominated him on the ground, and at the very end of the first round, he was basically mounted, and Claudio Ribeiro was just smashing him. He was curled up into a ball, and he was just being smashed repeatedly with nasty ground and pound. And had there been 5 to 10 seconds left on the clock extra, it would have been a first-round TKO, ground and pound finish. Claudio Ribeiro was just smashing him. He wasn't defending himself. Joseph Holmes had nothing to offer at the tail end of the first round, but he was saved by the bell. Then you go into the second round. The second round, he was still gassed. He tries to clinch up. Claudio Ribeiro clearly has more gas in the second round. They're clinching up. Joseph Holmes is kind of like half-heartedly in the clinch, leaning down, leaving his head massively exposed for a knee up the middle. Claudio Ribeiro knees him up the middle, drops him, and then finishes him off with brutal ground and pound, where he's basically defenseless on the ground, just getting smashed repeatedly. And now he has fallen to 8-4 after this fight. He's on a 2-fight losing streak and a 2-fight stoppage losing streak. He got finished in this fight via TKO. He got finished by rear naked choke in his last fight. You know, I just don't think he belongs in the UFC. He's not UFC caliber. I know he came off of Dana White's Contender Series, and then he won on Dana White's Contender Series. Then he came off of Dana White's Looking for a Fight, I believe. But Joseph Holmes, he lost to Jamie Pickett. Jamie Pickett doesn't belong in the UFC, okay? And then he lost to Young Park. Not a horrible loss. Lost to Claudio Ribeiro. Not a horrible loss. But the performance he's put on in these fights have been, you know, it's not an elite level fighter. He needs to go back to another organization. He needs to rebuild his skill set. And then maybe in the future he can come back to the UFC. But at this point in time, I just don't think that Joseph Holmes belongs in the UFC. He's 27 years old. He's still pretty young. He could have a career resurgence. We've seen career resurgence where guys have left the UFC, been cut from the organization, and then can come back. I'm not a big believer in Joseph Holmes, but I wish him the best, but he needs to be cut from the UFC. He does not belong on the roster. Moving on to number 2 on the list, who should be cut from the UFC after UFC 288, and that is Braxton Smith. And this is in no particular order. I'm just giving you a list of 3 because I have 3 fighters that belong to be cut after UFC 288. Braxton Smith, if this was in a particular order, you know, Braxton Smith probably is right in the middle anyway. But horrible performance. Gets finished by Parker Porter in the first round. Basically came out. He threw about 15 to 20, maybe 25 bombs. Missed most of them. And then just completely gassed. Midway through the fight, just completely gassed. And really, Parker Porter was just moving well, pumping the jab, landing some big shots of his own, landed a big uppercut. And then there was a moment where they were exchanging in the pocket, and they kind of clinched up for a second, and Parker Porter landed a knee to the body. Then all of a sudden, Braxton Smith kind of shot in on a takedown, but the way he shot in on the takedown was essentially like he was planking at the feet of Parker Porter. And Parker Porter just kind of sprawled it, ends up on top, and then just smashes him. He wasn't even in a cemented full mount, but he had like a full mount where his like ankle was almost close to his shoulder, where Parker Porter had his leg kind of over the top of the chest of Braxton Smith. Just pounded him out. Braxton Smith wasn't trying to get his hands on the hips, wasn't trying to break the posture of Parker Porter, and basically had nothing to offer, at all on the ground. I mean, he looked like he had never trained a day in his life in jiu-jitsu. I honestly believe, give me 2 weeks of training, I think I can go in there and take out Braxton Smith. Okay? That's how bad he looked at UFC 288. And, he's 5-2. What is he even doing on the roster at this point? The guy he beat in his last fight was 3-1. The guy before that, 3-2. Hasn't fought very good competition. I know the heavyweight division isn't good to begin with, but Parker Porter made Braxton Smith look like he didn't even belong in there. It was a horrible performance. No gas tank at all. We don't need Braxton Smith in the heavyweight division, okay? We do not need him at all. Horrible performance. Almost the most embarrassing performance on the card, but we're going to get to the other person who needs to be cut after this. But Parker Porter, when you're making Parker Porter look like maybe he's championship caliber in the cage, it's time for you to be cut from the organization. He's 33 years old. Normally that'd be old, but for the heavyweight division, it's not particularly old. I don't think he's going to go out there and come back to the UFC. I don't know if the UFC is going to give him another opportunity after this fight. I mean, he looked horrendous. I can't remember the name. It was a Russian guy that fought Greg Hardy like a couple years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago. And I can't remember that guy's name, but he looked horrible out there. He got cut immediately afterwards. That gave me the same feel as Braxton Smith in his fight against Parker Porter. I never want to see Braxton Smith fight again. I will never be picking Braxton Smith. I didn't pick Braxton Smith in this one. He needs to be cut from the organization immediately. If he's not caught already, Dana White, Sean Shelby, whoever else, Mick Maynard needs to get on that. Hunter Campbell. They need to cut Braxton Smith immediately. Moving on to the last person on the list. And if you watch my channel, if you watch my UFC 288 live stream watch along, if you watch my UFC 288 post fight, you already know who this is. And that is KRON Gracie needs to be cut from the organization. He fought Charles Jourdain in the fight that opened up the pay-per-view main card. KRON Gracie looked like absolute, there's not even a word to describe it. I want to say dog shit, but that doesn't even fully, describe what KRON Gracie looked like in his fight. His striking looked non-existent. His footwork looked non-existent. And all he did was essentially pull guard. And then when he wasn't pulling guard, he was dragging his ass across the canvas. It was an embarrassing performance. It made the UFC look bad, in my opinion. And Charles Jourdain essentially beat him up for 3 rounds. It was a 30-27 win for Charles Jourdain. KRON Gracie basically got his opportunity in the UFC because his last name is Gracie. And that is the true story behind KRON Gracie. And he hasn't fought. Before this fight, the last time he fought was all the way back in October of 2019. So he sat out for almost 4 years. He comes back against Charles Jourdain, who, don't get me wrong, I don't want to sit here and discredit Charles Jourdain, but he's not, the elite of the elite by any means. And Charles Jourdain beat the brakes off of him. And honestly, at no point was Charles Jourdain ever in any trouble in this fight. KRON Gracie would pull guard. He would never even try for a submission attempt. He just closed guard. He's just one grown man holding, wrapping his legs around another grown man for the entire fight. That's all he did, was just close his guard. And then when he would open the guard and Charles Jourdain would pop out and stand back up, he would butt scoot over to him, Claudio Puelles style. And I mean, the UFC has evolved to a point where these specialty guys, you used to have like a Damian Maia eventually kind of became well-rounded, but these specialty guys just don't work out in the UFC anymore. You can't just be a really good boxer. You can't just be a really good wrestler, and you can't just be a really good jiu-jitsu submission guy. It doesn't work in MMA. You have to have all the components that make you a well-rounded mixed martial artist. And spoiler alert, KRON Gracie doesn't have it. He will never have it. He's 34 years old. He got an opportunity because of his last name. Cut him from the organization. He's 5-2 on a 2-fight losing streak. Fought once in the last 4 years, basically 3.5 years if you want to be generous. And, KRON Gracie, if this was a list, KRON Gracie would have been number one. I mean, this was one of the most despicable performances I've seen. And honestly, I don't ever want to see KRON Gracie fight again. If he is booked for another fight, I'm not tuning in. It looked like he came in through a time machine. It looked like he was 1996 UFC coming in to fight in a tournament, and this is how he thought you were supposed to fight. He's the jiu-jitsu guy. He didn't realize MMA had evolved and everyone trains in all aspects. That's what it looked like in his performance. And this is one of the worst performances I've seen in MMA in a long time. He belongs in some jiu-jitsu competition. Maybe he can go over to one championship and compete, but I don't even think he can compete with those guys, to be quite honest. The champion over there, Mikey, I can't remember how you pronounce his last name, I think would absolutely wreck KRON Gracie. I knew nothing about jiu-jitsu, but I believe he would wreck him from what I've seen. I've watched most of Mikey's jiu-jitsu matches during the ONE FC cards because they mix them in. I don't even think KRON Gracie will be competitive there, but that's where he needs to be. He does not belong in a mixed martial arts setting. And I don't ever want to see him again in the UFC. Now, one more thing before I end this video. Which do I believe will get cut? I believe KRON Gracie will get cut from the organization. I believe Joseph Holmes will be cut from the organization. Braxton Smith is the one, because the heavyweight division is so lackluster, and Braxton Smith did just come out and throw like crazy, throw wild winging punches for the 30 seconds he was able to do it. I could see a case for the UFC keeping him just because the UFC heavyweight division is so lackluster and so talentless. But Joseph Holmes, KRON Gracie is gone. The other names that I thought about throwing on this list, but I figured, okay, we need to give him kind of maybe one more chance. One of the names was Marina Rodriguez. She's getting up there in age. She's 36 years old. She's on a 2-fight losing skid. She got dominated by Verna Jandiroba. I was thinking about putting her on the list, but I think she deserves at least one more opportunity. And then the other person I thought about putting on this list was Phil Hawes. He's 34 years old. He's been finished in 3 of his last 4 fights. He got KO'd by Chris Curtis. He got KO'd by Roman Dolidze. And he got KO'd by Ikram Aliskerov. I thought about throwing him on the list, and honestly, he's borderline. But he looked good early against Ikram. And I feel like he came back too soon. Maybe too soon after getting brutalized by Roman Dolidze. Maybe he should have took like a year off. We see these fighters who get brutally chinned. They come back 6 months later, or even sooner sometimes. And I just think maybe he needs some severe time off. But I do think there's a chance that Phil Hawes gets cut. It would not surprise me if Phil Hawes gets cut. I don't think Marina Rodriguez will get cut, but honestly, you can throw on that list. And another name you can throw on that list is Devin Clark. He's only on a 1-fight losing streak. He had a relatively exciting performance while it lasted against Kennedy Nchukwu. He's coming off a win over Da Eung Jung. So I don't think Devin Clark will get cut, especially considering the light heavyweight division isn't particularly talent rich. But, he's lost 2 out of his last 3. He has a win over William Knight, but that means absolutely nothing. He trades wins and losses, but the light heavyweight division isn't particularly stacked, and Devin Clark is usually in an exciting fights. So I don't believe he will be cut. And I think he still kind of does deserve, even though I don't think he's going anywhere, I think he does deserve an opportunity considering he's only on a 1-fight losing skid, and his performance wasn't the worst ever. He got choked out cold in the second round, but he hurt Kennedy in the first round, and then he got hurt himself. So it's just kind of one of those double-edged swords. I could honestly cut half the people in UFC 288, but I'm not going to. Let me know what you guys think. Is there any fighters that I missed that should be cut after the UFC 288 performance? And let me know about the 3 that I said should be cut from the organization. Do you agree, disagree? Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to let me know down in the comments. Do you want me to continue to do this video after every big pay-per-view? Let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.